Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Hi, I'm Charlie Hunt.
And I'm Jackie Kettler. We're both political scientists who also love to gossip about political scandals.
In Season 1 of Scandalized, we told the stories of some of our favorite scandals from across American history.
While we work on Season 2, we're dropping 5 brand new bite-sized episodes to whet your appetite.
Listen to new episodes of Scandalized starting Monday, September 29th at boisestatepublicradio.org or wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. More Idaho Matters right now. In 1969, Charlie Clements entered the Vietnam War as a pilot. However, after 9 months, something shifted. His moral convictions had changed, and he asked to be reassigned. But as a result, he was put in a psychiatric ward and later discharged from the Air Force. And this set him on a new path, trading in his wings for a stethoscope. Clements became a doctor and again went back to war, this time in El Salvador, where he cared for civilians behind enemy lines. His story became an Oscar-winning film called Witness to War, and next month he'll be sharing this film and more of his story at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Boise, and he's joining us now for a preview. Dr. Clements, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Really nice to have you with us, and I'd love to start back at the very beginning. What drew you to military service, and what were your initial expectations of heading to Vietnam?
Well, I grew up in an Air Force family. My father was a lieutenant colonel at the end of his career. My brother went to the Air Force Academy. I had grown up in an environment where service in the military was very honorable, and I think my life was oriented to a life of service.
So what shifted for you then during your time in Southeast Asia?
Of course, as any young man going into a combat zone, I was kind of excited at first, and then began to understand the reality that almost everything being presented to the American public was a lie, and I was being asked on a regular basis to falsify issues that contributed to that propaganda that was being uh, fed to the American public about light being at the end of the tunnel. And slowly, I realized that the war was immoral, the war was illegal, and that these were people fighting to rid the country of yet one more occupier after having finally defeated the French and then pushed the Japanese out after World War II, and we were just the next occupier of their country.
So after you asked to be reassigned, as I mentioned, you were placed under psychiatric observation. So what was that like? What was your reaction to that?
Well, I was puzzled and angry at first, and then I was told uh, if I was angry that they were going to medicate me, and I had to go before this council of other patients and explain how well I'd been doing, and they would vote me for privileges like being able to eat with a uh, knife and fork, for instance, was forbidden at first. And I made the comment that if you guys think I'm going to stick a fork in my heart about the Air Force, you are very misled. And I was told that that was a hostile comment, and it cost me a vote of privileges. And slowly I learned to go along. And
Mm.
it was not an abuse of psychiatry like in the Soviet Union. When a pilot expresses any hesitation, anger, depression about flying, they're required to see a psychiatrist. And in my case, this board of physicians decided I was not suitable for continued service in the
Mm.
Air Force.
How long were you in that psychiatric ward?
I was in there about 8 months.
What what got you through that period of time to get out on the other side?
Well, part of it was that I had gotten a good civil rights lawyer who finally got in the psych ward to come see me. And he said that everything I wanted to introduce as evidence in my defense was classified top secret and probably wouldn't be allowed in the courtroom. And
Mm.
I think that just made me more determined than ever to go forward with my decision, despite some scary consequences.
So can you Can you talk a little bit more about the classified information and how that did impact your time in the psychiatric ward?
Well, I didn't share that with other patients because it wasn't relevant to the hearings I would have when I wanted to get, further privileges. But I will mention
Mhm.
on a lighter note that the first time I got a pass to go out for an evening, you could go out at 6, I think, and you had to be back in by 11. I went to the base movie and Catch 22 was showing.
Oh my
And I
goodness.
just I just didn't find it funny, and I had to walk out and go back to the
Yeah.
hospital early for that time. But um, so, for instance, in early January of 1970, I was in Saigon, and they asked for a crew that all had top secret clearances. So we had a loadmaster who was an enlisted man. We had a flight engineer who was a sergeant. We had a navigator who was an officer, and a pilot and co-pilot. And our crew just happened to all have top secret clearances because we had moved nuclear weapons around from one base to another in Southeast Asia, not in Vietnam, but they were in Okinawa, and they were in uh, Clark in the Philippines. And so we got assigned that mission that morning in early January, and picked up 6 civilians from Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, and flew them to a rendezvous point in Cambodia, where we were met by MiG 15s and 17s from the Korean War, and they escorted us down to the runway. The civilians were met by a black limo. They went off for 8 hours. We stayed on the runway, kind of roasting in the heat. They came back, and we flew them back to Saigon. They never said thank you, good job, or ever introduced
Mhm.
themselves. And 2 days later in Saigon, when I was there drinking, I ran into a friend who was an All-American football player, and I had been on the track team, and we knew each other. And he was in civilian clothes, and I said, "Jeff, why are you in civilian clothes?" He said, "Well, I'm in the OSI. That's the equivalent of the Air Force FBI, because the only people allowed to wear civilian clothes were USAID and spooks, and the rest of us had to wear our fatigues anytime we went into uh, Saigon." He
Mhm.
invited me in for drinks, and um, one thing led to another. And as a young man will do, I kind of made a vague boast. I said I'd flown some diplomats, I thought, into a nearby country for some important discussions. And this guy across the table, who's I was introduced as Ski, and I'd been told he'd been in the Middle East for years, pretending to be Lawrence of Arabia, said, "Clements, you're really an idiot if you believe that. That was my crew on the team. And in 60 days, you'll see the leader of Cambodia, uh, Prince Sihanouk, go to Paris for his annual medical checkup, and a general named Lon Nol will take over. And shortly after that, we'll be invited to invade Cambodia." I didn't believe him, but 60 days later, listening to Armed Services radio, as we did sometimes when we flew, I heard that Prince Sihanouk had been toppled in a palace coup. And then a month later, I was shuttling combat ready U.S. soldiers to a point in the border that called a Parrot's Beak. And it was clear that the next
Mhm.
day Cambodia was going to be invaded. And that night I said, "I may not understand this, but I'm not going to do this any further." The other thing was, in flying over Cambodia, I saw large parts of it that looked like the moon, and we weren't supposed to be bombing there. But clearly, the only weapon system in the world that could make the countryside look like the moon was the B-52s, and so that was just another lie on top of the others.
Mm. So, after all of this, and as you said, your perspective changed. You end up in the psychiatric ward for about 8 months. You are then discharged. What is it that makes you decide, you know what, I'm going to go to medical school. I'm going to become a doctor?
Well, at first, I was afraid that maybe this was a reaction, that I wanted to prove I was okay by getting into medical school. And
Mm.
I wandered a little bit and ended up at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji teaching physics to islanders from all over the Pacific who would go back and be medical officers, kind of the equivalent of physician's assistants on their island. And I got so excited about their excitement and their lives of service ahead, I decided that, yeah, I really did want to do that. So I tried to get in medical school in New Zealand. I was 30 at the time. They said, "We admit medical students at 18. We don't think you'll ever get in here." So I went back to the University of Washington and applied and did my pre med studies and got in there.
So, Let's talk about your time in El Salvador. What took you there and what was happening in the country at that time?
Well, in about 1980, in this little hospital, county hospital in California, we had a clinic set up at night to see farm workers because they were afraid to come during the day, afraid immigration might apprehend them. And I began to hear stories about death squads in El Salvador and see evidence of people who had been tortured. Um, and I learned that the toll from those death squads in El Salvador at that time, and the war had not yet started, was about 1,000 people a month being disappeared. School
Mm,
teachers who belonged to the union called Andes, nuns, a slogan painted on the walls in San Salvador was "Be patriotic, kill a priest." Union leaders were regularly killed, and that's just a number for us. But El Salvador had a population 50 times smaller than the U.S., so they were. So you have to multiply that by 50 to get the emotional equivalent for us. It meant they were losing what we lost in 15 years of Vietnam every month.
mm,
And then we started sending helicopters and advisors there, and that's just the way Vietnam had begun. When I was 18, it was if we don't stop them in Vietnam, we'll have to stop them at the Golden Gate Bridge. And when I was 25, it was if we don't stop them in El Salvador, we'll have to stop them at the Rio Grande. So I had become a Quaker in the meantime. Quakers believe in bearing witness, which means that you stand beside people and share their stress and share
mhm.
your observations of what they're going through. And I decided I would bear witness in El Salvador as a physician.
And what was that like, that time in El Salvador? I mean, what was the medicine, like, what was the medical facilities like compared to what you were doing in the US? Can you talk about some of that and some of the patients you helped?
Well, in preparing to go down there, I had to kind of imagine the situation I would be in, and I imagined it pretty well. There was no electricity, there was no uh, operating room, just a dusty room in an adobe hut. And if we had someone to brush away flies with the operating team, that was uh, useful. Very little medicine.
Mm,
Uh, the area was probably that I rotated through about 15 villages, was probably 100 square miles, and it was bombed or rocketed or strafed almost daily by U.S. supplied aircraft, in part because the uh, military airbase Ilopango was nearby, and aircraft don't like to land with live ordnance, and so they would just drop whatever they had extra on the area in which I worked. So there was a lot of stress amongst the civilians there as well. So it was pretty seat of the pants medicine. I ended up amputating a young man's finger and using dental floss to amputate it with a Swiss Army knife and using
mm.
dental floss to sew it up with. I encourage people to soak, not people, but women to soak nails in glasses of water and then clean them with a piece of lemon and, and drink the rusty water. We called it the nail cocktail because there was malaria. There was almost no meat in the diet, and women were anemic. And so I had to think back to some of my pharmacy classes and uh, come up with some herbal remedies that might work because we were always short of medicine.
So, Dr. Clements, as a physician working behind enemy lines, how did your role differ from your time in the military? And how did you reaffirm your commitment to nonviolence? Because, as you said, during this time, you'd also become a Quaker.
Well, certainly the commitment to nonviolence was always challenged, and just because I had a commitment to nonviolence didn't mean that I wasn't angry, and I often envisioned picking up an M16 and firing at some of those planes that were uh, bombing and strafing us. I had flown some of them in training, not the fighter version, but the T-37 is the training version of the A-37, and I could tell where the aircraft were going, and people thought I was very courageous, but I could could tell if I was safe, and they couldn't turn sharp enough to come
Mm.
after the people perhaps where I was standing. Um, so nonviolence in the middle of a war is a very complicated affair. I knew that if wounded patients were captured, that they would be tortured. And that was pretty much standard practice. And so, at times I had to ask myself, would I when I was on guard at the hospital overnight, would I use the weapon, or would I just fire it in the air to kind of warn people
Mm,
to stay away? But there was always a challenge to that, and
mhm.
because one is committed to nonviolence, it doesn't mean that emotionally you aren't disturbed by it.
So you wrote a book about your experience, and then your story ended up being told in a short documentary, and the documentary was called "A Witness to War." I'm curious about what it was like seeing your life portrayed like that. I mean, in a documentary.
It was strange at times, and the first time I saw the film, actually, I was in the back of the auditorium at Cherry Street in Philadelphia. The film was made by the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker NGO that's won a couple of Nobel Prizes over a 100-year period of time. And I didn't like the film. I didn't know how
Mm,
nasal I sounded. I didn't. There's some embarrassing moments in the film where I'm writing to a professor back at the academy about the hippies protesting the war in Vietnam, whom I would later come to understand knew more than I did at that time. But I was willing to go to Vietnam to defend their right to protest and free speech. So it was strange, and I didn't like the film at first, and I thought I should see how other people responded to it, and other people seemed to be moved by it, and then it won the Academy Award, so I guess I couldn't complain too much. But the agreement I had with the filmmakers is that they could film anybody, they could ask anything, but I wasn't to be involved in any decisions about the film itself.
okay. So you mentioned it won an Academy Award. We should say it won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Short. So talk to us about that experience. I mean, not only is this this is your life, and then it's put into a documentary, and now it's on one of the largest stages when it comes to to movies.
Well, the night of the Academy Awards, uh, in those days, they didn't invite the subjects of films, and so the producer and director were invited to the Academy Awards. And about 4:30 that afternoon, and the red carpet started at 5. Ed Asner called me and said, "I got you and your girlfriend a ticket. I got you." So I rushed to her house, and we got dressed and went there. And that night happened to be the fifth anniversary of the murder of Archbishop Romero. And so when Deborah Schaefer
Mm,
and David Goodman accepted the award, she looked the camera in the eye and she said, "We dedicate this to Oscar Romero and all of the people who have died in El Salvador since his murder 5 years ago." And that was blanked out in Chile and blanked out in El Salvador, but seen by the rest of the world. It was a really special moment. Advertising that night, it cost about $250,000 for, uh, uh, I think, 5 minutes, and I think we got about $125,000 worth of advertising in about the war in El Salvador.
mm. What was that like to witness that night?
It was pretty remarkable. Really didn't expect that uh, we would win. We were up against some pretty really good films, uh, and I had no idea until they opened that envelope that we would win, and it was pretty
Mm.
special. And as a result of what I had done, I got to know Mike Farrell quite well, the actor from MASH, and of course we compared experiences with him acting in a movie about being a doctor in a war and my being a doctor in a war, and I got to meet a lot of people in Hollywood as a result of that experience. And then they actually tried to make it into a feature film, but I'm glad that didn't work because
Yeah.
the screenwriters had to take some liberties that would have made me very uncomfortable. But they said, "Well, we have to sex it up a little bit."
Oh. Mm. So talk to us too about the fact that I think around the same time the Boise Peace Quilters sewed a really wonderful quilt for you. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think this was in the book that you wrote, correct?
No, the book was published in '84, and some of the Boise Peace Quilters read it, imagined scenes from the book they had read. The film hadn't been made yet, uh, and
Mm.
presented me with this quilt, and I was quite honored. They were making quilts for peacemakers and putting Boise on the international map. They gave one to Gorbachev and presented it to him in Geneva at the United Nations. They presented one to Pete Seeger, and they made Helen Caldicott, the Australian pediatrician who was an anti-war activist, anti-nuclear war activist, and they made a beautiful one for me, which I'm bringing back to Boise on Veterans Day, so that uh, 4 generations of Idahoans who have never seen it can see the beautiful thing that these women created and honored me with.
Mm. So before I let you go, you mentioned you're bringing this quilt back next week. You will be talking at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. You have spent a lot of time, a lot of your life advocating for peace, justice, and human rights. So as we wrap up today, what keeps you hopeful um, in the face of ongoing global conflicts?
Well, this is a difficult time in that regard. I have to say, but so was 1982 in El Salvador, with when President Reagan was president, and saying that we needed more bombs and bullets for these freedom fighters because they're running out of ammunition, and that was all propaganda, of course, and they weren't freedom fighters; they were death squad leaders and such. But I'm inspired by um, something a Unitarian minister said, and that Martin Luther King made famous, and that was the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And
Mm.
I think that if you look out throughout history, that's true. Uh, and it isn't bent by gravity; it's bent by brave men and women trying to change the world. And I'm confident that that will happen, but sometimes it takes a lot longer than we hope it will. And I think we're in a difficult situation now, but I think we'll come out of this okay.
Well, Dr. Clements, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about all of this. Really appreciated it. We've been speaking with Dr. Charlie Clements about his humanitarian work. He will be sharing more about his personal story next month, November 11th, at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Boise. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
The stories don't stop when this podcast does. Boise State Public Radio's Instagram gives you reels, updates, and snapshots from our reporters in the field. Follow Boise State Public Radio on Instagram today.